Good evening and welcome. This is our Zoom lecture series with a new hybrid option for tonight. So we're very pleased to be here to welcome you all to this beautiful place on the University of San Diego's campus, as well as to all of our watchers on Zoom. So welcome to you all. My name is Sister Juliette Mousseau, and I serve at FST as the Vice President for Academic Affairs. This evening, we have a distinguished professor, Dr. Bill Cook, who is presenting. Dr. Cook is the Distinguished Teaching Professor of History, Emeritus, at SUNY Geneseo, and he's a renowned scholar of medieval history. A graduate of Cornell University, he has authored 5 books on the medieval world and St. Francis of Assisi, and has recorded 9 series, not lectures, series for the great courses. In addition to his academic legacy, he is the founder of the Bill Cook Foundation, which supports global education for children in need across 30 countries. This evening's lecture is titled Francis of Assisi, Our Master Teacher of the Virtue of Empathy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cook.
I'm guessing that I'm more colorfully dressed than many of your speakers. Don't own a brown thing to my name, I think. Well, I think most of us, whatever our political views, whatever our religious views, we know this is a time of troubles. We know it's a time where it seems like some of the old ideas and even some of the old virtues just don't seem to work. And I think most of us think about that. So I titled the lecture Empathy with a colon, Francis of Assisi and the Recovery of Empathy in Our Time. So let me start with a definition, a very simple definition. Empathy is our ability to see the world through other people's eyes. And we know how hard it is sometimes to sort of bond in any way with people we meet who are just so different than us, whether in religion or ethnicity or language or whatever it might be. And we deal with that strangeness, and it's very hard to sort of try to imagine how they see the world. I'm going to give you an example. I was an 18-year-old freshman at a small liberal arts college in Indiana called Wabash College, and I arrived there, and I had a new professor at the college, so we were both freshmen in some way, except he was a freshman who was a Harvard PhD and a Rhodes Scholar, and he was blind. The first blind Rhodes Scholar, in fact. And because I was advisee, I'd be in his office, and I'd watch him operate in his office, and he had a seeing eye dog, and I really wanted to know what it was like to be blind. I'd never been around a blind person before. And being an industrious freshman, I came up with a research project. On the weekend, when most of the students are gone, I'll walk around the fraternity house with my eyes closed, and I'll sort of get it. And for several Saturdays, most people are doing really interesting things on Saturday. I'm walking around the house with my eyes closed, tells you what kind of a guy I am. And I'm walking around, and I'm after a few weeks, I got it. I really understand it now. Well, you probably know what's going to happen. So the next time I went out, I bumped into something I wasn't expecting, and I opened my eyes. I don't know what it's like to be blind, and I'll never know in the way he knows what it means to be blind. But even trying to figure out what it was like to be him was a good educational experience for me, although I probably wouldn't have described it at that time. But today, it seems to me, empathy is not something that's nice to have. It really is a necessity. Because even without all the media, we bump into all different kinds of people all the time. The beggar on the street. Today I stayed in the private apartment of Papa Doug Manchester. By the way, he's got nicer furniture than I have. Probably doesn't surprise you. And, that I've known him for many years, but it gives me a little bit of insight into him. What's hanging on his walls and, what things make him comfortable and what does he snack on? I know all these things. And, you just want to get inside people and see if if it helps to know them better by trying to imagine, and it is the imagination, how the world looks through his eyes, what he perceives, because it will be different than mine. And whether we're seeing a homeless person on the street, or when I travel for my foundation, I travel to pretty exotic places. I'm not used to being in South Sudan, for example. And when I go there, and I know a little bit about his history, I have a couple of people I know there to meet, and I haven't a clue what it's like to be South Sudanese. But I want a clue, because in many ways, to sympathize, you've got to empathize, or at least with empathy, it makes it easier to express sympathy in concrete ways. So I struggle with this. Well, one thing that seems to me obvious, after all, as an academic, is we can learn a lot by reading. And I'm assuming many of you probably have liberal arts degrees. You know what that's like. You read a speech of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is buried in Rochester, New York, a few miles from me. So Frederick Douglass is sort of one of my favorites. And, you read his piece or the speech that he gave, which is all about empathy. What is the 4th of July for the Negro, which he gave in Rochester? And basically what he said is, to a white audience, you're going to have a hard time with this because you just haven't seen the world the way I grew up as a slave on a farm and then escaped and whatever. And I think of that book, The Life of Frederick Douglass, or the Odyssey. Why did Odysseus do that? I don't think I'd have done that. What did he see, or how did he see it that I'm not getting? And I think any kind of great reading of one of the classics does that. Or I guess my favorite is Dante's Divine Comedy. It is, if you'll pardon the expression, a hell of a journey, or at least it is for the first third. And it's important to read and to try to, not just get the plot, not just in that sort of freshman literature course way, try to pass the exam, but to really let the characters teach you and let the author take you into their lives. But I think that that's not enough. When we watch television, all of a sudden there are just people I don't understand, groups of people. Minneapolis comes to mind recently. I don't know what it's like to be an ICE agent. I don't know what it's like to be somebody that the ICE agents are chasing. I can't really understand and really feel what they're feeling. And you want to watch television, you want to listen to interviews and all the rest. But again, still, you have to find ways to struggle. I want to tell you a story that happened to me just a few years ago. I was teaching about Francis of Assisi to a group of college professors in Siena, Italy. So I'm, boning up on Francis. And I'm walking to where the classroom was. And a kid came up and he was a beggar. And he begged. And the classic thing you tend to do when you're a little bit nervous, you take the euro and sort of drop it in his hand, right? You may never touch him, but at least you give him a euro, you're being nice. And the next day he was there, and the next day and the next day. And one day he wasn't there. And I looked around, he was sitting down. I don't know whether he didn't see me or whether he was just tired or sick or whatever. And I went over and I sat down with him. And boy, was that an education. And I looked up and saw the people who, just shrugged their shoulders or looked disparagingly on him, what kind of a dirty kid. He really sort of dirty kid in dirty clothes and whatever. And then the people who simply refused to look at him. They wouldn't recognize his existence. And that reminded me of a story I'd heard about Andrew Young, former mayor of Atlanta. One time when he was mayor, he didn't shave for a few days, put on old clothes, and sat as a beggar in Atlanta for 24 hours, maybe 48, I don't remember. And then he held a news conference. I guess that's what two-day beggars do. And he had a news conference, and they asked him, what was the worst part? He said, it wasn't the people that looked at me and shrugged their heads. It's the people who wouldn't look at me. They refused to recognize my existence. And boy, was that a lesson for me. I never thought about it that way. How many beggars do I walk by in any big city, anywhere in the world, and never give them a glance, never seem to think they're important enough to even pay any attention to or see. And so that's been a big thing for me, to try to have teachers like Dante. I want to show you Dante here. This is a very famous painting of him in the Cathedral of Florence. And over on the left is hell, and then you see the seven-story mountain of purgatory, and then heaven is the parts above where you see the sun in one of those curves. So Dante really is my teacher. But as much as I love my teacher Dante, I may love my teacher Adrian, the boy I met on the streets of Siena, even more. And I want to tell you, they're two great teachers. And I think it's easy to recognize one, and it's not easy to recognize the other as somebody that can teach us. We're educated, we've got money in our pockets, and all those sorts of things. And so I think it's so important, especially after college, we recognize that we're going to read books by smart people. We're going to watch smart people on TV. We got to do better than that. We've got to reach out beyond the people that make us comfortable to the people who make us uncomfortable. And that's exactly what happened when I met that boy in Siena. There's Andrew Young, of course. I hope you got Andrew Young up there. Yes, I just want to make sure. I'm not good with technology, and you never know. And I think also we recognize one of the ways we can learn empathy is sort of finding people that we think live the best lives, people who have lived exemplary lives, which we assume include empathy. And therefore, we might be able to learn from them. And too often, we ignore so many chances to learn. I asked somebody the other day, how many of the last 25 Nobel Peace Prize winners could you identify, or do you know anything about, or had you ever tried to learn anything from them? Because we have to find educational programs for ourselves, which may involve reading Dante or other books. It may involve meeting a beggar on the street. It also means there's some people who are pretty good at empathy. I think I wouldn't, swear on a stack of Bibles that every person who's won the Nobel Peace Prize is empathetic, but probably it's a pretty good thing to do. And we need to look for people who are contemporaries, near contemporaries, people we've heard about all of our lives. And for me, I think about Nelson Mandela. How could that man, after all those years in prison, come out and with dignity and grace, and I think genuine love, be the leader of a country in which he'd been treated so badly all of his life? I want to get to know that guy. And reading a biography is part of it. There's got to be more to it than that. One has to be thoughtful. One has to look at pictures. One has to look at film. One has to look at all the kinds of sources we have. I think of Oscar Romero. I can remember being in El Salvador where he was murdered and going down to see his tomb and really learning his story. And I'm sure you've all had this situation. I knew who he was. I'd read about him. Great man, a saint. It's a little bit different where you see where he was shot. It's a little bit different when you go down and sort of touch that grave and kneel with other people around that grave. It can lead you deeper into what made him such a great man, how his empathy was expressed and lived. And there he is. And I think of Mother Teresa, obviously. But one of my personal favorites, some of you who are old will remember who this is, I think. Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a woman from Mississippi with an 8th grade education who tried to form the Democratic Freedom Party in Mississippi and get it seated for the 1964 Democratic Convention. And they had her on national TV testifying before the Credentials Committee. And she said, and this shook me up as an American. I was in college at the time. She said, if you won't seat us, the Black delegation, I question America. I'd never heard anybody question America before. Obviously, we hear it a lot more today. But that shocked me. that led me to read about her. It led me to go down to Ruleville, Mississippi. And, in some sense, you want to sort of absorb the vibes. Well, I'll tell you what I did. I wanted to go to where she went to church, Baptist church. So I found the Baptist church, and it was Sunday, and I walked in. Woman said, "I'm sorry, we don't have any service today. Our minister goes around his circuit, but we're having Sunday school. You go up and meet with the men." So I went up, and they welcomed me. And then everybody gathered together. The kids had a group, and the women had a group, and men had a group. So the children reported, and the women reported. And the man who was to report said, "Now Bill Cook's going to give us a talk." What do I have to tell them? They've got so much to tell me through their experience, through the way they express themselves. And to me, that was one of the great honors, to be able to address them. Well, I got to hear the rest of the story. So when I was leaving, I said, "I'm so happy to be here at Fannie Lou Hamer's church." They said, "Oh, this isn't Fannie Lou Hamer's church. It's the one down the street." So I went down the street, and their service was just starting. I sat in the back, and a little crippled black man with crutches runs over to me and said, "You come and sit with me." I thought, oh my God, it's a penalty box or something. I sat with the elders. And I thought, what these people have suffered. Boy, I don't know how much education they have. Most of them had very little. They're educated about a lot of things better than I am. And we just have to be with all kinds of people. And we have to take some chances, it seems to me, if we are going to really try to experience in the best possible way this idea of empathy. Well, we look for models in history. Socrates sounds like a pretty good model. And we've got some good stories about him and Plato and so on. And we need to do that. We need to read about people very different from ourselves in different times and different cultures. And one of my favorites, because I live a lot of the year in Siena, is Catherine of Siena. And to be with her, she died at the age of 33. But, she walked down the street where my apartment is. And you read the books and you're there. And you begin to really understand what makes her a great saint. I mean, yes, it's good to read her writing. It's good to read books about her. It's also good to walk in her town and to, some people find this grotesque. I don't particularly, that in the church of San Domenico is Catherine of Siena's head. Now, you hear the tourists come in, they're all sort of pointing and giggling. But there is some way in which you're in the presence of this extraordinary saint, the co-patron saint of Europe, the co-patron saint of Italy, and this woman whose writings are so extraordinary, whose testimony is so wonderful. So those are some of the people I look to. But it probably won't surprise you, given where I am and who I am, that my guy's Francis. And I did graduate work on Hussite heretics in what was then Czechoslovakia. And the damn Soviets invaded, and it was just so difficult to work there. So I decided I need to I'm a church historian, I got to find a place to work. So the food's good in Italy, and they got a lot of Catholics, so let's sort of drive around there. And I'd read The Life of St. Francis by Bonaventure. And I was a graduate student, and you knew the professor was going to quiz you, and how you read that way. But when I was traveling and got to Assisi, I thought, I want to get a copy of the Legenda Maior. And I walked into the church, and of course, there's many, many, many stories there, but only 28 of them are on the wall. And that led to my scholarly life. Why did they pick those 28? Why were they the 28 meaningful? I need to read Francis of Assisi through the eyes of the people who picked those 28 stories out of the hundreds of stories that you find in the Legenda Maior. And after a while, you get to know people, people who died many centuries ago. And you really feel like in some ways you are experiencing them. So I nominate Francis as the guy. And here he is. And this painting you're looking at now is the earliest painting of St. Francis. It was done 9 years after he died. And it's in a little town in Tuscany where the church is locked up most of the time. Call me if you want to get in. I know the people. At any rate, it's Francis and 6 stories from his life. Actually, it's 2 stories from his life and 4 miracles he performed after his death. Well, come on. I want the pictures of his life. Why did they think, first painting ever done of them that we know of, why did they choose those 6 stories? And then you go to see others, and there are 20 stories, and there are the 28 in Assisi. And you get to see Francis from all these angles. And again, you come to meet not just a one-dimensional saint, but a multidimensional saint, just like when you read different biographies of individuals. So my experience has been here. And I think that if we find ways, whether it's through art, through literature, through travel, through all kinds of things, if we set our mind to, we're going to try to put ourselves and imagine ourselves in other people's boots, that is a pretty good postgraduate education. Well, let's talk about Francis. Obviously, I don't need to do the biographies, born in 1181 or 1182. And it's interesting because when Francis was born, Daddy wasn't around. Daddy went to France to make money. He was in the cloth business, and he was there for that purpose. So that sort of registers, number one. Daddy wasn't around for the birth. And Daddy came back and said, have you named him yet? And the answer was yes. He said, nope, that won't do. We're going to name him Francesco, the French one, because I was in France when he was born. So this introduces you into the life of Francis a little bit, because we're going to try to figure out sort of who he is. And Francis was a little bit uncomfortable, even being the rich merchant kid. He wanted to be a soldier because that was a higher grade in the hierarchy. And he went off to Perugia in a battle, spent a year in prison, came back, kind of freaked out for a while, and then decided, no, he's really going to be a knight. He gets his horse, he gets his everything ready to go, and he goes off on a war where he was being recruited into a papal army. He never got farther than the next town over, and he turned around and came back. Something was wrong. That goal that he had of being a real soldier this time, not getting imprisoned, and being a soldier for the Pope, for goodness sake, we don't know what happened. He never tells us in anything that we read what happened to him, but something powerful transformed him. And this is a statue now. It's a modern statue on the yard in front of the Basilica of St. Francis, where he's buried. And just that slumped over body and the slumped over horse. And he had to start all over again. And, sometimes when we think about saints, at least when we first get to know their lives, we sometimes just look at, what they did after they had some sort of conversion. It's all good stuff. And here's this guy struggling. And what does he do? Well, it's very interesting because he decided to go on a kind of pilgrimage to Rome. And when he got to Rome, we don't know what moved him on this, but he sort of took off all of his clothes and traded them with a beggar and sort of wore beggar's clothes. Now, his dad was a cloth merchant. Dad's in the clothing business. Well, when you think about it, he came back to Assisi and sort of settled in again. And, if you're going to do something wacky like that, you ought to do it some way far away from home because nobody will see you. And Francis got back and he began to do strange things, like rebuilding a church, actually more than one. This is from the movie of the 1970s. I always sort of liked this particular picture. And of course, that's meant to represent San Damiano, which he rebuilt. Francis heard this voice, go and rebuild my church. And he took it literally and did it. And Francis is clearly sort of shopping for something, it seems to me. It's so easy when you look at a saint and say, boy, this person was loved by God and is in heaven and did all these wonderful things we see pictures of and so on and so forth. But when we enter into all these different roads he took, you sort of say, I've done that too. I understand that. And the fact that he does sort of, kind of wacky things and things that certainly his father thought all that stuff was pretty nutty. And then he also, in addition to rebuilding churches, he volunteered at the local leper colony. And he would go wash the feet of lepers. Dad wasn't happy about this, of course. But at any rate, we just can try to understand what it's like, because I think we've had this experience. He tells us about it himself in one of his writings. He said, I was out one day in the woods and I was sort of, being me. And a beggar came and asked for a coin. And he sort of dropped the coin politely in his hand. And then he began to say, who am I? What should I feel for that beggar? And a few days later, he said another one came and he gave him a coin, gave him a hug. And he said, and these are his own words, after that, it was easy to leave the world. Sometimes it's hard to identify with a saint who does a lot of miracles and these great heroic things. I think we've all had some experience like that. Some moment where we've sort of been transformed by little things. This isn't things that made the news. Again, he wrote about this, but it isn't even included in all the early biographies. So, here he is again with the lepers and so on, and we're trying to learn what Francis is like and how he comes to be so empathetic, how he can, in that first time, just treat the leper as some radical other that needs a coin, and the next time embrace him as a brother. I want to get inside that person. I want to see how, if I can, that spirit, that mind works, because we've all had experiences. Sometimes they change us for a little while and we go back to things, and sometimes we sort of never forget about them. So, as we know, pretty soon, Francis, I wanted to show you this. This is Francis hugging the leper. This is a modern ceramic made by a ceramicist in Assisi. This is actually in my house. And if that isn't about empathy, I don't know what is. That this artist, who's about 80 years old now, really has captured this, because there's this sort of thorn bush there. And here's this poor leper. Francis is not just, giving him a symbolic hug. Look at that embrace. This artist, I think, really gets it. He is experiencing through his art what Francis experienced. And so we know the story. Francis strips himself naked and he makes an extraordinary declaration, right? He says, before I used to be the son of Pietro di Bernardone, but now I proclaim that my Father is our Father who art in heaven. And it seems to me that what Francis is doing in some ways is making the statement for his life. What does it mean to say that my Father is our Father in heaven? What are the implications? And I think we see in Francis's words, his deeds, many different actions, exactly what that was like. And so we find that Francis takes on this new life. And I think we've all had that experience. Again, it may be a beggar in the street. It may be seeing an ad for the Christian Children's Fund on TV. It may be many, many different things. But every now and then we sort of have to say, I can't ignore this person. He or she may be dirty, may have done some bad things in lives, may be an ex-con, maybe all kinds of things, but also I need to try to see the world through his or her eyes. That's not to excuse things they did, but I have to try to understand what it's like to be them. Otherwise, how can I treat them fully in the kind of love that we should be treating people? And it's a wonderful thing. And so, as we know, as weird as the story is of Francis stripping himself naked before his dad, the weirder thing is some other guys say, I'm going to do that too. They apparently experienced empathy by observing Francis. Many of them came from the same social class as Francis. And I'm sure they're saying, he used to be a nice guy. What's the matter with this weirdo? But you can't let that be the last word. And so it sort of requires you to enter into a different level of thinking and experiencing. And we see how many people came to visit Francis. And I want to argue that, here's this grubby guy and he's begging and all the rest of it. But I know growing up in a middle class suburb in the Midwest, we don't see many beggars, only when you go downtown. And, we were sort of taught to, sort of step around that. And Francis didn't step around the second time. And I want to know why. I want to get inside that. And, Bonaventure's a great writer. Thomas of Celano's a great writer. He can't tell us that. He can lead us into a meditation and a thought about it, but he can't really teach us that. And once you know these stories, you can, in your own imperfect way, it seems to me, say, I'm going to try to experience something differently. And one time I was in an office in Boston begging for money with some rich people. And they all had something to do, so I went off by myself to lunch. And I walked out of the building, and there was a woman begging for money for lunch. I got out some coins and then I thought, wait a minute. This is not what Francis would do. I said, let's have lunch. One of the most meaningful events of my life. The story she told, divorce, alcoholism, all these things. She was just a kind of a dirty lady begging. And she became fully human to me just having lunch with her. Just spending not just a few bucks, but a few minutes with her. So it seems to me if we're working on empathy, we need to do it. We can do it spiritually. We can do it intellectually, and we need to do it. We need to do it, in terms as well. And boy, if somebody says, "Who are some of the great teachers of your life?" That woman's one of them. I don't even know her name, but boy, she won the teaching award for me for a long time. So what I would say to people is, when you see a beggar, don't just drop a coin in his or her hand. Ask them how they are. You'd be surprised how long it's been since anybody asked or cared. And that's really an important thing to do. And with an expression, sometimes people shun you away, but the expression of gratitude, maybe a little bit of a smile, maybe even a few words that open up. You could ask a question, not being probing, like, why are you here? But to just find out a little bit about this person. That is a part of education. You don't get it very much in classrooms. You don't get it a lot in books. You get it talking to people so different than you, including many who society shuns. And I think that when we look at that, it takes me to the Canticle of the Creatures. Because it seems to me what the Canticle of the Creatures is all about is, okay, Francis has this nice way of logical thinking. He didn't know it's logical, but this is, if God is my father because he created me, and God also created trees and dolphins and everything else, then we're all brothers and sisters. And I think the great discovery for Francis is what that meant. If you really believe that, how do you act? Whether it's with an animal or a tree or a person. And for me, that Francis is the greatest teacher of empathy because everything was his brother, not just not just nice looking people, not just well clothed people. Speaking of well clothed people, that Francis is not particularly well clothed, as we have to remind ourselves. But I want to tell you something that I really don't like. Okay, this is my negative part of the lecture. I don't like images of Francis where he's only with nice animals. Look at that. Oh, like those animals. That sold in a store in Assisi. I took it in the winter. And it makes me crazy. There's got to be a worm in there. Francis picked worms off the road because his brother worm. And just listening to the Canticle of the Creatures is so important because, as he says, he loves all animals, all things, not just good weather, any old weather. because everything we are in brother and sisterhood with if we understand. And when you're with your brothers and sisters, you can communicate on a different level. It takes away a lot of the sort of, way we stand away from strangers or people who are richer than we are or poorer than we are or whatever it is. And this makes me crazy. I got to get it off the screen. But what we have here is, Francis loved all these creatures. And we know at one point he decided to go off to visit the crusade, the Fifth Crusade, which was in Egypt. When he got there, and I guess the quick story is he wasn't very impressed by the Christian soldiers. He went over to meet the Sultan. And of course, we all know, and they got along. And we have here, this is a preaching to the Sultan. This is a 13th century painting. Here is a little bit later one, where he hugs the Sultan. I mean, he's grown up in a world of crusades. He was born just before the Third Crusade. There had been a Fourth Crusade. This was the Fifth Crusade. And there are many more to come, of course. But this is what Francis and the Sultan discovered. Again, what Francis knew has to be applied. It's one thing to hug a nice Christian guy and say brother or sister, but the Sultan was his brother, just like the worm is his brother, as well as a beautiful flying bird or whatever. And I think Francis, in all the facets of his being, really does allow us to understand how we can become part of a universe in a new way. And yes, we need some knowledge. Yes, we need some spare time. We really need to develop the empathy that we can sort of say, I want to try to imagine being in those shoes, in that situation. I don't think many of the Crusaders would have hugged the Sultan if they'd had a chance. Francis did. And I think that's so important for understanding. So, I was going to read the whole Canticle of the Creatures because, well, one should. But let me make one more point about Francis and his life. And that is, when he wrote the Canticle, and we often forget this, I think, well, you don't, but most people do. He wrote it in a tiny little room, and he was probably what we would call legally blind at the time. He didn't just come from a sunny 2020 experience. That's what makes Francis the person of empathy that I want to learn from. And I want to try to draw some experiences from. And then it seems to me the extraordinary sort of next step is that God gives Francis a unique opportunity to have empathy with Christ because he marks the wounds of Christ with his body. Francis can experience Jesus in a way that till that time nobody ever had. And so if we think about his life as sort of developing greater and greater empathy, God rewards him with this chance to know Jesus on a level of experience that no other person had known. And so my model in all this is Francis. And I think that it's so important that we consider all of this. Now, I want to tell you a couple stories. Tell me if I can go in more than 3 hours. You can wave to me. I taught Dante one time, actually several times, in Attica prison. Most of you are old enough to remember the Attica riot, which was the bloodiest prison riot in American history. It was a nightly news thing. And I taught a course on Dante, and half my students were murderers. I'd never been around murderers. And I'm locked in a room with them. There's no guard inside the room. And I had a student come up to me. We had a break. The student said, I understand this, Dante, because of all these tortures. He said, I was a torturer. He had worked for the dictator of the Dominican Republic. He had fled to the United States and been arrested for I don't know what. you know, I got to try. I know a lot of different people. I know people who have done some bad things. I don't know any close. What an experience. And then in the very next class, I had a student who I knew was a murderer. And I'm teaching about Paolo and Francesca, Canto 5 of Inferno, where every time something comes up, Paolo and Francesca, well, we didn't have any choice, we really, our fault. When I'm teaching that, this great big guy, and I knew he was a murderer, put up his hand and said, "That's me. That's why I'm here." He thinks I taught Dante to him than me, more than I'll ever know. Because he understood that experience that Dante said leads to damnation. I want to tell you, he graduated, but more than that, about 15 years later, I ran into him. He was out. And the first thing we talked about, other than how are you, is, have you read Dante lately? The answer was yes. That he found empathy in that story in Inferno 5. And, there's so many stories in Dante, although that's one of the most famous. But it was such an extraordinary experience to hear him say that. And I think that it's another reason to say we really need to find empathy. Am I not getting pictures anymore? I do. Okay. Oh, good. Well, I want to be very quick. Can I be quick? Oh, I won't be. I get that. I want to tell you how this leads to empathy. Because it's dedicated to St. Martin. So there's St. Martin. He's a Roman soldier. He's on his horse. And a beggar comes up to him. And he cuts his cloak in half and gives half the cloak to the beggar. He's a 4th century saint. And that night, he went to bed. You can see part of the cloak is over him. And Christ appears wearing the other half of the cloak. What you give to the least of these, you give to me. And so this was the model for this charitable organization in Florence. This was the story that led them to their work. And they painted on other walls the work they do. For example, what we have here is bailing people out of jail. Okay? Get people out of jail. And then we have this one. This is giving clothes to those who need them. And here, giving drink. But what this picture shows is really interesting because these guys realize, these merchants, Florence isn't like Jerusalem 1,500 years ago. We got to update the things that Jesus teaches us because one of the problems in Florence, because of that there were so many girls who couldn't marry because they didn't have dowries. So one of our jobs, right there in the list of, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, is pay for dowries. And this is a painting of, you can see the guy on the left sitting down, writing down everything that goes in the box there. And that's the girl's dowry. And then there's the wedding. So what we've got to do is update. So it's important to study what St. Martin did. It's important to study what St. Francis did. And it's also important we do what these merchants do and say, okay, those are all valid, important teachings we want to do. Now, what else do we have to do? What do we have that are the great needs that were not perhaps needs at another time? Well, I want to tell you that what I decided to do after I retired is start a foundation. And we work in Africa and Asia, and we provide education. Work a lot through friars, by the way, especially in Kenya. And so here we see some people with certificates. That's a pretty proud thing. And here we see some kids that are gathered in a schoolyard, and that is the only girls' high school in the entire nation of South Sudan. Do you know what's happened? the next town over's jealous. Now, I don't usually approve of jealousy. This is great because they're saying our daughters are as good as their daughters. We want a school. We're trying to build that one now. And here we have girls in our girls' high school, 400 girls, the only school in the whole country that has it. But boy, is it making a difference. And another picture. And by the way, they have a nice school. I mean, it's very simple. I want to show you who built it. The mothers. Those are the mothers handing the bricks up to the people on the scaffolding because they're illiterate. 90% of women in South Sudan are illiterate, but by God, their daughters are going to be illiterate. And they'll probably never have another illiterate person in their family. And like I say, I'm happy to have a village that, is angry that their kids don't have it too. We're working on it. This is in Guatemala. This works with Covenant House. I'm sure most of you know the charity Covenant House. They work with trafficked girls in Guatemala. And we helped us put them through school. And somebody said to me, we really should have some music. Okay. Music's a great thing. It's one of those things that might even make you more empathetic, to draw you into and to work in conjunction with the other girls. You got to all play together and be on the same page. Well, I got some things for them and I went down there to visit and the guy said, this is Guatemala. We want marimbas. Where the hell am I going to get a marimba? They're expensive. I have a friend who's on the board of the Grateful Dead's charity, and those are the Grateful Dead marimbas that we got. There they are. There they are. And these girls, this music is, they're going to school, but I have a sense this music is more important therapy for them than even, learning a trade, because they comfort each other when they hit the wrong note, and they're a team. They've never been in a team before. I think we know that's one of the things about sports that, at least ideally, is what we want to do. Well, and we work in Honduras also through Covenant House. And I learned about a village where, picture this, all the people move 2 months a year because their village is so poor, they can't live there all year. They pick coffee beans, and after 2 months, they've earned enough, they can come back to their village, live in their village. So guess what happened? The coffee bean plantations were destroyed by a hurricane. These are the people coming to the United States. And this guy I met in Honduras, who has a charity of his own, said, my charity will help them get medical care. And if you could provide them with food and snacks and books, I think we can get the families to stay. They want to stay. It's the only place I've ever lived in their lives. And they stayed, and it takes 6 years to get new coffee bean plants up and running. This is year 6. And they made it. And, you read about all the sort of impersonal wheeling and dealing of things that cost millions of dollars. We did this for a few $1,000s. And again, you not only do that as a charity, but you get close to the people. There they are celebrating. They've got their bag for the month of their new crayons. And I met a Down syndrome boy in Peru. And nobody paid any attention to him. So I asked about what I should do, and they said, well, see if you can find some help. Well, let me tell you, we now have 32 kids in the program. They'd mostly been at home. Nobody knew those kids existed because they were so ashamed of them. If you want to meet happy people, you meet the mothers of these kids. Their kids can write a little bit and play a game and sing and dance, and they hold up the certificates we give them as if they'd just gotten into Yale. It is so beautiful. If somebody says, where would you like to be right now? I'd rather be there. This is nice, but I'd rather be there. And this is an example of a mother and her child. Doesn't cost a lot of money, but if you've been looking for ways to come to get to know various people and to come to be intimate with them, and you've got Francis as an example and other examples along the way, you're on the road to getting your PhD in empathy. And that may be the most important thing you ever do in your life. Thank you.